Hey guys, so my name is Pete Rambo, and I'm here with good friend and fellow sojourner, a member of our fellowship here, a writer for 11:3 Restoration, as well as occasional video blogger, or maybe it's the reverse. You're an occasional writer, and what we're going to do is we're going to have a little discussion here. It's kind of prompted in part because today we enjoyed a podcast by Eric Kahn, and he was discussing, I guess, a tweet blow up that had happened as a result of a Brian Suave article and podcast that they had done regarding modesty. And while we totally agree with a lot of things that they had to say with how the left, particularly, well, the left in general, but especially the left in terms of religious and theological circles, and we've been the victims of that to some degree with regards to how red herrings are thrown and logical fallacies and all sorts of different things in order to avoid addressing the real deep theological issues literally in what Scripture actually says. We really enjoyed that part. However, you called me and you said, man, I'm not sure I'm totally with how they are interpreting modesty. And it's something we've discussed a number of times. And so I'd like you to start really just by kind of defining what Scripture has to say with regards to modesty, what it doesn't say, and maybe talk a little bit about how, as a matter of religious tradition, we have come to a number of different places with what's defined as modest, which may or may not be what Scripture actually says. So let me let you kick it off kind of that way, and then we'll see where it goes.
Okay. So let me start off with saying two things. First, I am not, because when we get into this, conclusions can be drawn. So I want to start off by explaining what I'm not promoting. I am not promoting that our women start running around in string bikinis and lingerie and all of this stuff in public. Not promoting that. So that's the first thing I wanted to make sure that's clarified right up front. The second thing that I think I need to clarify is the definition of the word modest as it's used in the New Testament, the Brit Hadashah. That particular word is used twice. It's translated as modest one time in most English translations, and that's in 1 Timothy. And if you read that passage and you understand the context, it means appropriate to the occasion. That's what Paul is saying. And he's specifically addressing the attitude of the women when they're coming to the assembly or interactions with the assembly. So we can go through that in a little bit more detail, but ultimately, my understanding of the definition of modesty, that particular word in English, right, that's translated from Greek, is just that. It's appropriate to the occasion. And then there's some framework that's got to be put in with that to understand how do we determine what's appropriate to the occasion and all that kind of stuff that the Scriptures don't really address. And so I don't know if that's a fair summary of what you're asking for here, but that's basically where I'm at.
No, that's a good place to start and a good place to understand appropriate to the occasion. Now, how would that differ from the typical Orthodox Christian position that seems to have this definition that varies from one denomination to another, or even one generation to another, based on what their sensibilities are, saying, right, oh no, a gunny sack looks really good, versus, different attire.
So, me growing up in independent Baptist circles, I attended 3 different churches as a member of those churches throughout my life, and I was familiar with many others, and there really was there was a kind of a progression. Like in the beginning, it basically was modest means frumpy. Or that's, some version of that. I may be oversimplifying that, but sure. But it's like basically it's got to be less attractive in order to be modest. Anything that could be deemed as sexy or as I don't know, attractive as far as the woman's body is concerned was frowned upon. It was either looked at as being completely sinful or just a negative in some way or whatever. So that's my experience from the churches that I was a part of. And here's the problem: the Bible never defines it that way. But that is sort of the running theme that we have through the past several centuries of what I would label as the puritanical church mindset. And so that's the issue is I don't see that particular understanding actually being based in Scripture. It's very much based subjectively on man's opinion of the whole issue. I don't see anything from Scripture, and we'll address some of the claims that are made by folks that they claim Scripture addresses it, and I'll demonstrate how that's not what it addresses. But that's my biggest issue, is that we're labeling, I shouldn't say we, the church in general, is labeling something as a sin when Scripture never calls it a sin. Again, there's wisdom issues involved in all of that, but it's not wrong. It's not a sin in and of itself for a woman to dress in a sexy manner.
Okay, so you're saying that God gave woman curves. God made her look appealing,
Mm-hmm.
and there's nothing inherently wrong with her accentuating those things that are appealing. Where would be the boundaries or the limitations in your mind on that?
First of all, divine boundaries and limitations. Are we talking about where does it cross the line into being sin? Or are we talking about where does it cross the line in the terms of socially acceptable and just general decorum?
Okay. And that's a great point that you make, because in fact, Christendom has a habit of establishing as sin those things that are doctrinally or doctrinal foibles, or they'll establish lines that the Scripture doesn't establish, and then determine that as a sin. So essentially creating their own law.
Right.
Okay. So
I'm glad I clarified that.
yes.
You clarified that. All right. So let me
Okay,
answer the question now
yeah.
because I wanted you to sort of make that distinction. Definition of sin is transgression of the Torah, transgression of the law. So these things are not sinful. Technically, if you want to get really right down to it, nakedness, being completely naked, is not a sin. Again,
it might be
excessively unwise.
It might be shameful, but
those
it's not
kind of
sin.
things, but it's not sin.
Yes.
So my answer to you as far as what's the standard, what's too far, whatever, my answer is that's determined by the man who is in charge of the particular woman. That's where your sin comes in, is if a man who is in charge of a particular woman. Most of the time we're talking about a husband or a father being in charge of a daughter. Mm-hmm. If she is ignoring or going against his wishes, that's when it becomes sinful. I have standards for my wife and for my daughters. And some of them have to do with the fact that I know the mindset of other men, and I want to make sure that it's appropriate and all of that. Some of them have to do with just things that are practical with regards to what they're wearing. We live in the middle of the woods. We're trying to turn these 34 acres of woods into a farm, but we still live in the middle of the woods. Well, there's copperheads, there's scorpions, there's we have all types of different things. So guess what? When my wife and my daughters go into the woods, or they're basically off of the quote unquote beaten path that we have, I expect them to wear closed-toed shoes. I expect them to wear pants. that go to their ankles. But that's not a function of sexy versus not sexy. That's a function of safety. That's just practical. That's appropriate to the occasion. So that's where, if they violated that would be just as wrong as, say I have a standard that they're not allowed to wear a bikini to the pool, right? Again, this is hypothetical. I'm not necessarily going to give my standard specifically here as far as that stuff is concerned. And one of my, say I have that standard, and one of my daughters decided, I'm going to sneak out of the house with a bikini on under my clothes and, go to the pool and run around in my bikini. Well, that would be just as wrong. My point is, if I have a standard, wear closed-toed shoes when you're in the woods, and they choose to go in there in flip-flops, that's just as wrong as sneaking off to the pool in a bikini when that's against my standard. My reason for the standard is irrelevant at that point. So the sin is the disobedience to their head. It's not the fact that it's about being too revealing versus safety within the woods.
Excellent. Okay. So appropriate to the occasion means that you don't necessarily have to wear closed-toed shoes and jeans to Shabbat.
Right. In fact, I'm glad you brought up Shabbat.
In fact, I know exactly what. Yeah, please.
My standard with regards to our meetings that we have as a congregation on Shabbat is I require my wife and my daughters to wear a dress or a skirt for that event. Again, that's my own personal standard. It's not something that I've come up with from Scripture or whatever. It's something I prefer my wife and my daughters to do.
And it's not a standard that has been set by the fellowship.
No, not at all.
It's your personal standard.
Correct.
Yes.
Not at all. It's not set by our fellowship at all. There are ladies at our fellowship who wear pants almost every Sabbath. Fine. I have no problem with that as long as their husband is approving of that or their father is approving of that. But for my house, I expect, unless I make an exception, which there have been times at the request of my daughters for some reason, that I've allowed them to wear pants to our Sabbath meetings, but for the most part, I don't. But again, that's my personal standard. So,
okay, so where is the line in terms of looking out for or taking care of your brother? And by that I mean not, your standard or a man's thought process on how his woman's to dress appropriate to a particular occasion. Where is the line in terms of what he needs to factor in terms of loving his brother and not creating a stumbling block?
Again, I think that line is very subjective. Part of that comes into gaining a correct understanding of the term lust, gaining a correct understanding of coveting, gaining a correct understanding of all of that.
All right, give us a quick definition on both of those.
Well, lust and coveting are essentially the same thing. Generally, in English, when we read it in the Bible, the word lust is referencing some sort of sexual desire that's inappropriate. Most of the time. Not all the time. In fact, many times the word lust, I shouldn't say many, sometimes, the word lust in our English translations of the Bible, it's referencing a good desire, right? So it's not always universally a negative thing. Right?
And this is a challenge, too, just to take a quick side trip, wherein the definitions of words or the understanding of words can change over time. Because I know in the KJV, for example, Yeshua, Jesus, says, I have lusted to have this Passover meal. You know, he's speaking to the disciples. So he's talking about how much I earnestly desired that. Right. But it's not a sinful desire, where in other cases it talks about lusting after a woman. And so we both know that passage actually means a married woman. It's a gune,
yes.
Right? And so that's actually to covet or desire unlawfully something that doesn't belong to you.
Yes, it's Yeshua. I mean, you're referencing Matthew 7?
I think it's a 5. Yeah.
It's somewhere in 5, 6, or 7.
Yeah.
When he taught, what he's doing is he's explaining, guys, when you're coveting a woman, right? Because that's one of the 10 words, right? Thou shalt not covet your neighbor's woman. When you're coveting a woman, you're coveting another man's woman. it's equivalent to adultery. That's what he's saying there. Christianity has built this whole theology, and that's part of where the misunderstanding about modesty comes from, around the idea that lust is simply any sexual desire. In some cases, people even promote that you can be guilty of lust with your own wife. I've actually had that presented to me a couple of times. It's certainly not the mainstream idea, but that idea is out there. But the point is, the mainstream idea of the word lust is any desire for a woman's physical body other than the woman that you're married to. It is the general idea of the definition of lust, and that's an incorrect definition. It's coveting. It's desiring to take her unlawfully. It's desiring to steal her from her husband.
So, as an example, just to help me understand this, if my neighbor has a red Corvette and he parks it in his yard, and I go over and go, "Wow, that's a nice looking car. You have done really well for yourself. That's a beautiful car, and I think it's amazing." That would not be wrong, but it would be wrong if I went over and I went, I wonder how I can get the keys and take this for a test drive.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, assuming you're taking the test drive without his permission.
Right,
Yes.
right.
Agreed.
Right, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. That is exactly the distinction. Unlawfully possessed. I want to steal his car, right? Having that desire is the same thing as I want to steal his woman. Appreciating the beauty of that car or the beauty of that woman is not in and of itself wrong. So that's where the causing a brother to stumble thing, right? I mean, honestly, a man, and both of us are married, right? And,
yes.
And having this conversation, what I'm about to say is it rubs us the wrong way, but it rubs us the wrong way because we misunderstand all of this. A man recognizing that my woman is attractive, and even that she's sexy, is not the same thing as desiring to steal her. So, as far as causing a brother to stumble, what's the stumbling? The stumbling is his misunderstanding of the word lust. So, again, do I want my wife or my daughters to run around in public, in string bikini? No, I don't. But again, and yes, the idea is that she'll be viewed a certain way by those in public, and part of that is our culture, right? Our culture views dressing provocatively as being something that is inherently in and of itself wrong, right? It's in fact, in the podcast in question, one of the men, and I can't remember which off the top of my head, he said that during this whole debacle, right, his wife is not a part of Twitter, right? She's not on Twitter at all.
It was Eric.
She completely ignores it. And so he looked at his wife, and he just simply asked her a straight up question without giving her the full context. And he said to her, if you see a woman on the beach in a string bikini, actually, I don't know if it was a string bikini or just a bikini.
He just said bikini.
In a bikini, what do you think of that woman? And her response was that she's either a stripper or a whore. Well, that is, especially within the Christian realm, that is the assumption. But again, that assumption is based on a misunderstanding of the word modest, right? So, to me, when he said that, right, it's an example of him basing his understanding of this issue on man's opinion, specifically in that case, a woman's opinion, right? Women are more harsh to other women in most cases than any man is harsh to a woman, as far as this type of issue. That's another thing I experienced in the church when I was growing up in the independent Baptist circles, is that most of the women in the church, they dressed a certain way based on the opinions of the other women in the church, right? In my opinion, an exact violation of what Paul is talking about in 2 Timothy. They were dressing to be viewed as good or righteous or wealthy or whatever, take your pick what adjective you want to put there, by the other women in the church. It wasn't about pleasing their husband at all. I can't think of a single time where that was the case. Oh well, that's an overstatement. I guess I shouldn't say it that way. There were times when the man had this opinion, again, incorrect opinion about what lust meant and what was appropriate or inappropriate and all of that. And so yes, she did obey what he wanted her to do. I'm not saying they all didn't, but by and large, that was a major issue. Actually.
No, I agree completely, because what happens is we impose on the text what our subjective opinion of what modesty is, and then judge everybody else by that standard. Mm-hmm. To go back to the hypothetical woman on the beach in a bikini, is it appropriate to the occasion? And if that's what her husband wants her in, or if it is approved by whoever her head is, yeah,
agreed.
Same woman at the grocery store, it's probably not appropriate to the occasion, and
But let me say one more thing about that, right? Same woman at the grocery store wearing a bikini, right? If that's what her husband wanted her to wear, well, the problem is her husband's not hers. So
if there's sin in causing someone else to stumble, that's his sin, not hers.
If she's submitting to what he has asked her to do, yes.
I agree with you. I agree with you. I think there are a lot of people that will get a little they'll get uptight about that, but that's right. I think that's the way Scripture is written.
Absolutely.
So excellent.
And we can go to one of the passages that was brought up was Exodus 28 in the podcast that we were talking about. So Exodus 28. If you look at Exodus 28, and this was an attempt to define the word nakedness from Scripture. And so what they did was they went to Exodus 28, which is talking about the priestly garments, right? Mm-hmm. And here's the issue that I take with this. They're taking a specific command specifically for the priest when the priest is in the tabernacle performing specific service for Yahweh.
Right.
And they're taking that as the definition of nakedness. Well, that's a gigantic leap, right? Because the problem is you'd have to go through this whole thing, and I mean there's a whole lot more than just what it talks about covering the genitals. There's a whole lot more there that you'd have to apply also. That's number one. Number two, again, this is specific to the priest, and it's specific for when they enter the tabernacle.
Right.
Well, it doesn't say anything about outside the tabernacle.
Right.
It does. So it's a major assumption to say that is the definition that we should run with to define nakedness outside of the tabernacle.
Right. In fact, the way that's written, if I'm not mistaken, specifically the way that's written, it specifically is saying that this is where I want you to do it, which we can deduce from that everything outside of that doesn't necessarily apply to
it's not
because
the norm
it's a specific
elsewhere.
Circumstance.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's specifically Exodus 28 verses 40 through 43. So, if anyone wants to look that up. And then they reference something in Isaiah, and I did not jot down the reference, but I did look up that same word in Isaiah, and again, it's not an establishment of a definition of nakedness. Number one. Number two, it's also not an establishment of, hey, this is in and of itself a bad thing. It is in the context of judgment and shame, but it's not, again, you can't take from that and define, okay, therefore anything other than this is sin. It's simply not there.
Right.
So,
and to be clear, going back to that particular podcast, which we will link in the comments below, so that you have some context, and because we agree very much with their handling of the theological left and wokeism in general, and the importation of all sorts of bad cancel culture tactics instead of having a proper theological discussion about truth.
right.
We certainly support that and everything there. We'd like a lot of what Eric and
I'd love to have a conversation with Eric.
That
I think he and I would
cool.
agree on a lot of things. So.
And actually, I think you'd agree a lot more in some of these areas. Although you'd have to test his limits a little bit with some of this, because, but very good. Anything else you want to say here?
Well, yes, the glaring point that I think is missed in the modesty discussion, in almost every discussion that I've ever heard about it, and almost every teaching I've ever heard about it, and almost every blog post and every podcast, anything I've ever heard about it, the glaring thing that is absolutely almost 100% of the time absent is that the woman should be getting her instruction from her husband or her father. That, and the truth is, that is the number one point that should be made in every one of these discussions. So that's if there's one takeaway from this whole discussion, it's that. Consult with your husband, consult with your father. What does he desire you to wear in any given situation?
And Eric and Brian, to their credit, may have made that point in the first part that really sparked the big Twitter firestorm.
Very possible. I didn't listen to that part.
He mentioned it. I think Eric mentioned it very briefly at the very beginning of the podcast that we listened to today.
Eric is definitely a patriarch minded.
Absolutely.
As are these other men, I assume. This is the first I've heard from them. But to me, they don't major on, in this particular subject, they don't major on that point like they should. Because it really should be the number one question, not somewhere down on the list.
Yeah. So
Anything that needs to be clarified?
one thing that comes to mind for me is the relationship between the modesty issue and jewelry, and even like pompous or prideful, boastful ways of coming in, be with others. And I know that Joel's talked about, the way that people.
That's in 1 Timothy, yeah.
Right? Yeah. So I remember reading something about that. And I didn't hear you talk too much about it. So if you want, you can share your.
Let me get there. You said it's also in 1 Peter?
Yeah, doesn't he also talk about not adorning yourself with braided hair and gold and
that's
what
1
have you?
Timothy.
1 Timothy.
1 Timothy 2 verses 9 through. Well, let me just start in 9. Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments, but rather by means of good works, as is proper for women making a claim to godliness. A woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness. But I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. For it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. But women will be preserved through the bearing of children if they continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-restraint. So, to me, when I read this, he isn't what he's setting it as a contrast to the lack of good work, the lack of. It's an attitude issue. So it's not that the jewelry or the fine clothing or whatever is wrong in and of itself. What he's doing is he's setting it as that's not the point. That's not the goal. The goal is that your attitude be right. That you be a woman who professes godliness. That you be so. That, I don't think he's saying here that it's wrong for a woman to wear jewelry at all. In fact, if you want to get real technical, if he would also be saying it's wrong for them to wear clothing. I don't think he's saying that either. So the point is, don't be again. If you want to get real technical, don't flaunt your wealth. I mean, that's and again, I think we can apply that to don't flaunt, your whatever it is. What you're supposed to be displaying is an attitude of godliness.
Yeah, and that actually leads into kind of like the next question I had and related to it, where in that same vein is what kind of relationship does the way a woman dresses have to certain attitudes that she might have about herself or about how she's presenting herself? Like, is there certain attitudes and a relationship going on there between the way they dress and the way they even behave?
So that question probably has multiple answers. because a woman who is submitted to her husband is going to be dressing how he wants her to dress, right? A woman who grasps what we just discussed, right? She's going to be dressing how her husband wants her to dress. So if she is constantly going around, to use Eric Kahn's, it was Brian's words, constantly going around looking like a whore, well, if that's how her husband wanted her to dress, we got a wisdom issue there on the part of her husband, but it's actually reflecting her submissiveness to him. Again, I can't think of any, wise and godly husband actually wanting his wife to do that. Obviously, I'm picking an extreme example there. Yeah. But to me, that's how it applies. So it's when the women begin to ignore their husband's wishes and dress how they want that it becomes a problem. And that can go either direction. I have personally seen it go the other direction. A husband wants a woman to wear, a particular outfit that's a little bit more revealing when they go on a date or something of that nature, and she just flat refuses, and she, wears something that he doesn't even like because she thinks that's more holy. Well, that. Can I use the term BS? That's BS.
She's walking in sin at that point because she's not doing what he asked her to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
So ultimately, it really what's important here is making sure as men we kind of consider what kind of impact that might have on the women in which we're offering these dress codes to, or something like that. Where you're making her dress like a whore and she feels like a whore, that might contribute to an attitude of being a whore when she's trying to be submissive to you. But it's like it does something when she gets this attention and this and that, and like it's feeding something that she doesn't want to feed. Like, as men are going to be responsible for anything that comes of that, right?
Yeah, absolutely,
so,
absolutely. If she's submitted to her man, and she's carrying out what he's instructing her, and that's resulting in, whatever it is that ends up being a detriment to her or others around her, that is squarely upon the man whom she is appropriately submitted to. Again, it's a lack of wisdom on the part of that man. And that's where, what we were discussing earlier, that's where in a properly run community, a properly run congregation where we have a plurality of elders, you know what? We should be able to discuss those things with each other, right? Now, I don't think that, and you're never going to see me do this. A woman shows up to the Sabbath meetings with pants on. Well, I have a different, standard for my women. I'm not going to go to Pete and say, "Hey, why'd you let Kelly wear pants? That was inappropriate." Well, no, that's that. So we got to be very careful not to be imposing our subjective opinion of what is appropriate to the occasion on other men.
That's going to require us as men to be a little more involved in our woman's way of perceiving those situations as well, because I'm familiar with circumstances where, they're doing it, or they can do this, but I can't, right? And now you got to deal with that attitude, and you're going to have to endure whatever comes with fellowshipping with people that do things differently. Yeah. And you're going to have to be a lot more involved in your woman's life and situation, to help curb that comparative, attitude of what I don't have.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah. Absolutely.
All right.
Right. Sorry. So, guys, fantastic. Good discussion here on modesty and a lot more, but we invite you to come to 11:3 Restoration. It's based on 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3. The head of every man is Messiah, and the head of woman is man, and God is the head of Messiah. We invite you to come to 113restoration.com and participate in the discussion. Check out the YouTube channel as well, which this will be posted on, as well as notsav.com. And some heavy discussion on headship, patriarchy, marriage, adultery, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, and what the Word has to say, not what we've imported from culture or from Greco-Romanism and paganism. There's a lot that's been imported from Greco-Roman paganism as well. So, fantastic. All right, guys. We look forward to hearing your comments and catching up, talking with you as we move on down the road. Shalom.
Shalom, shalom. We don't want the suction cup to the table and that fall over.
Yeah.
Yeah, we haven't had any
can make
cameras
that a
fall
meme.
over since
That
we
one
started
was a
using this.
suction cup? I didn't know.
Yeah, a couple times.
It was
it's
a
just,
vehicle mount
It just sort of goes
designed to go on a window.
You guys are just
in the middle of videos.